Jeremy Bentham is considered as the founder of classical utilitarianism. In his opinion, whether an action is moral or not depends on whether it causes more pleasure or more pain for all those affected. With his hedonistic calculus, he presents a method for calculating the pleasure-pain balance of actions. Bentham was an English lawyer, philosopher, and social reformer. He lived from 1748 to 1832. Jeremy Bentham was born near London, the son of a wealthy lawyer, and began studying law and philosophy at Oxford at the age of just 12. He completed his studies at the age of 15 and began training as a lawyer. Bentham worked as a lawyer for several years before devoting himself exclusively to science and political reform. He is enthusiastic about the exactness of the natural sciences. This is reflected in his philosophical thinking and ethics. Together with James Mill, the father of John Stuart Mill, he founded the Philosophical Radicals movement. They campaigned for more democracy and social reforms and against the authority of the church and the privileges of the ruling classes. They fought for universal and secret suffrage, the abolition of slavery, and a liberal reform of criminal law. Bentham was one of England's most important social reformers in the 19th century and a pioneer of the modern welfare state. With utilitarianism, he developed a welfare economy in late feudal and early capitalist England with the aim of creating more social justice. John Stuart Mill, therefore, said of Bentham, "He was not a great philosopher, but he was a great reformer in philosophy." Bentham calls for universal suffrage, equal rights for women, and the abolition of the death penalty. He also campaigned for animal rights. Bentham is regarded as a pioneer of democracy, liberalism, individual legal rights, feminism, and the animal rights movement. His main work, An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, was published in 1789. In it, he systematically develops the moral philosophical position of utilitarianism. Bentham writes, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do." He assumes that people strive to experience as much pleasure and as little pain as possible. Based on this view of humanity, Bentham formulated the principle of utilitarianism as the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Happiness is defined as pleasure and the absence of pain. The goal of all actions should therefore be a predominance of pleasure over pain. In contrast to Kant, utilitarianism therefore sees the measure of a morally good action not in its underlying goodwill, but solely in its utility, its benefit. This benefit is measured by the consequences of the action. If the consequences of the action are positive, that is, if the action results in as much pleasure and as little pain as possible, then the action is moral. All those involved in the action must be considered equally. Bentham advocates quantitative utilitarianism. In his view, all pleasures, physical and mental, are of equal value. There are no qualitative differences. In addition, all those involved in an action must be considered equally when calculating the pleasure-pain balance. This calculation can be made using the so-called hedonistic calculus. The hedonistic calculus can be used to calculate the pleasure-pain balance of actions. 7 criteria must be taken into account. How intense is the pleasure or the pain? How long does the pleasure or pain last? How likely will the pleasure or pain be? When will the pleasure or pain come? Immediately or later? Will the action have further consequences or side effects? Are these positive or negative? Is the pleasure pure or is it mixed with pain? If several people are affected by the action, the extent must also be taken into account. So you ask yourself how many people are affected by the action, and then take them all equally into account in the calculation. Bentham also wanted to apply this type of moral calculation to legislation and find methods of calculating the general benefit that would lead to uniform results. Let's work out together how Katya should decide in a difficult situation according to Bentham's hedonistic calculation. Katya has arranged to go to Paul's birthday party with her friend Sarah. They wanted to meet at the hut in the woods where the party is taking place and then cycle home together. Just before Katya leaves the house, her friend Max calls. He is writing a very important math exam tomorrow and asks Katya to help him study. If he doesn't pass the exam, he has to leave school. As there is no cell phone reception in the forest, Katya can't call her friend to cancel. How should Katya decide? As several people are affected by Katya's decision, we first determine the extent of the action and list the people affected. Katya's decision directly affects Katya herself, her friend Sarah, Paul, who is celebrating the party, and Max, who needs help studying math. We then assign values between -5 and 5 for the alternative actions, go to the party, and help Max study math. We mark the alternative, party with Sarah, in pink, and the alternative, math with Max, in blue. The action with the best overall balance is ultimately the right one and should be chosen. As this sample calculation only serves to illustrate the method, we will only pick out a few individual values in the explanation. Here is Katya's pleasure-pain balance sheet. When it comes to the intensity criterion, we see a small difference in the pleasure-pain balance. Her pleasure at the party is certainly dampened when she knows that she has let down her friend Max, who desperately needs her help. When she studies with Max, Katya's pleasure is greater. After all, Sarah can have fun at the party without her. The difference between the two options becomes particularly clear when it comes to the consequences. While Max will hold his poor math grade against her for a long time to come, Sarah probably won't even think about the fact that Katya stood her up at the party a day later. Now to Sarah's pleasure-pain balance sheet. Let's take a look at the duration criterion. Sarah will be briefly happy when Katya shows up at the party. However, as many of her other friends are there and she sees Katya every day anyway, the joy is not too great. If Katya doesn't show up, Sarah will feel sorry for a moment, but will quickly be distracted and carry on partying. With Sarah, we see a big difference in the proximity and distance criteria. The joy at Katya's appearance is very close, as is the sorrow at her non-appearance. Paul, who is throwing the party, doesn't have too much of a difference in the pleasure-pain balance for criteria 1 to 5. As he has invited lots of other guests, he may not even notice whether Katya turns up or not. We see the greatest difference in his balance when it comes to the criterion of purity. He either feels pure joy or pure sorrow. Katya's decision is the hardest for Max. We can see this very clearly in his pleasure-pain balance. After all, his future depends on whether Katya helps him or not. Having to leave school would be an intense, long-lasting suffering that is certain to occur, and soon with further negative consequences. There is no joy mixed in with this option. We add up the values. The action alternative, learning math with Max, has the better overall balance. It generates the most pleasure and the least pain for all those affected. We would probably also have intuitively judged this decision to be the morally correct one. Since neither of the two options is in the negative range, that is, causes more pain than pleasure for all those affected, both options would be legitimate according to Bentham. In applying Bentham's hedonistic calculus, however, some difficulties became apparent. First of all, it is difficult to determine who is affected by an action. Maybe someone at the party is secretly in love with Katya and is sad as hell that she won't be there. Then we realized that pleasure or pain is very difficult to calculate, especially when it comes to the pleasure or pain of other people. The more people are involved in an action, the more difficult the calculation becomes. Pleasure and pain vary depending on the person and situation, and therefore cannot be objectively determined, measured, and quantified. It is also very difficult to compare pleasure and pain. In addition, the basis for calculating the hedonistic calculation is very vague. The consequences of actions are not certain, but only probable, if at all. And if in reality a completely different, unforeseen consequence occurs, the balance sheet is no longer correct in the end. Let's imagine for a moment that Sarah is attacked and raped on her way back from the party because she is cycling alone. It also takes a very long time to set up and calculate such a complicated calculation. We can also ask ourselves whether all desires or pleasures should really be considered equally. Should a social, destructive, or even sadistic desires also be taken into account? For example, those of the potential rapist. And if not, on what grounds? If the morality of an act is measured solely by the pleasure-pain balance of its consequences? Utilitarian action is often counterintuitive. It contradicts people's moral intuition. Because the pleasure of many can be offset against the suffering of a few, actions that are intuitively recognized as immoral can be legitimized. For example, if all of Max's classmates were very happy that he didn't pass his exam and had to leave school, it would be morally imperative not to help him study. John Stuart Mill attempted to solve some of the problems of Bentham's quantitative utilitarianism by critically developing his approach further. Mill's version of utilitarianism, qualitative utilitarianism, is the subject of the next episode in this series.